So we come to Reform and Fulfilling Lives report that we're looking at today and the themes. Thank you to the speakers so far. I hope you can see, going into talking about our findings, the social context that this fits within. There was a report last year which was done by the heads of social services across the North East that said out of the 20 worst local authorities, the North East had 12 of them. And that since austerity, there's been a 77% increase in the number of children going into care in the North East. So there's no question, it's not debatable, there is a link between poverty and child removal. And that means every single person in this room could face this issue at some point. We all know the statistics around how many missed wages it is to homelessness. This isn't specialist, this isn't something that happens to other people, this is something that happens to women who live next door to us. So, it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility, and relationships matter. So I'm going to talk about two women's journeys. So the first one is Kim. So Kim was a heartbreaking story. There's a common theme between the two stories, and that's domestic violence was at the heart of these. So Kim was somebody who left home really early and was a heat-seeking missile for domestic abuse, just sorted out. And she had three stories, three relationships which punctuated her story, and they were all extremely violent or controlling relationships. She came to us and she did the interviews, I think it was within 6 or 9 months of this incident that the quote's on the screen. But basically what happened was social services were involved because of an extremely violent ex who she'd managed to get out of her home, and she was living on her own. And then he came back. He was not the father of her children. He came back to the house one night when she had a son and a daughter in a care, and he put her windows out. So she did the right thing and phoned the police, and the police phoned social services, and a safeguarding check was done, and the case was knocked up a notch, and they were put under more scrutiny about what was going on, which at that point was academic, because it was only a week later that the same guy came back and set fire to her car. And it was at that point that social workers came in and said, you can't keep your children safe, they have to leave. And so those children were taken and given to our ex-partners, who were both perpetrators of domestic violence against her. She was then told, because she couldn't keep her children safe where she was, that she would have to move. And if you're wondering, there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute that guy. So even though social services had enough suspicion to remove the children because of risk of harm, there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute, because there's a double standard attached to these stories. So she moved, and she was assured that she would be given help with curtains and carpets. She had absolutely no money, and she was in pieces. She was also told that she'd get help with her gas and her electric. She was given help with that, but unfortunately when they changed her meters, it robbed all of the credit that was on it. And so she was instantly in fuel poverty, and her anxiety was ramped up. When she came and sat with us, she'd been in that new property for 4 months. She still had no carpets, she still had no curtains. And the reason for that was a few things. One, she fell between the cracks. So she couldn't get any help from a domestic violence service that she'd outreach to, because she hadn't pressed charges. She was too frightened to press charges. She didn't know what else to do. Because she didn't, she can't get support. She couldn't get any help with curtains and carpets because she didn't have her kids living with her. And they only help people who have children and need it. And so the barriers of how the bureaucracy failed this woman were just mounting up. And this was the story I mentioned earlier, where me and Kate, she left the room and we just did this huge exhale. I mean, we were just infuriated by this story, because it is not her fault that she was the victim of this crime. This guy is not prosecuted, nothing's come to him. but she's lost her children, she's lost her home, she's living in really difficult conditions. And when she was speaking to us that day, it was September, and she was looking at a winter without carpets and curtains, as well as not being able to have her daughter back in her care. You know, that was the position she was put in. There was loads of other difficulties within that story. A daughter who went to live with perpetrator 2, would not let us see the child when social services were involved. They decided she needed supervised contact with her daughter. So when she was having this supervised contact, her daughter was just in absolute bits, distraught, screaming, crying, begging to go home, couldn't understand what was preventing her from going home. It was so distressing, the mum elected to knock it down and just do Teams calls or Zoom calls, because it was just unmanageable the way that it was. But that came with its own problems and own difficulties, because then this little girl is doing that Teams call with her dad in the next room, and the report was the volume was on full, so she had to be really careful what she said, and she would type little messages to her mum, but her mum wasn't tech savvy, so she couldn't get them. She couldn't catch them, and she didn't know how to reply to them. I mean, just an absolutely awful picture. Relationships matter. Well, my heart went out to this woman, because all of the skills that you have, effective communication, how to advocate for yourself, how to get something done, none of them. This woman had been beaten into the ground and absolutely had no idea how to fight for her bairns. Now, we're all professionals in this room, and if I picked the phone up to any one of you, I can guarantee you would respond to that call, you would find a way through the bureaucracy of it, you'd figure out a way for her to get her carpets and get her curtains. That did happen, because I picked the phone up and I did it. But she doesn't have the skills. So who does she go to get that done? A fluke chance of doing research with me meant that that happened, but I'm not doing research every day of the week, so who's going to pick that up? We need something in place to recognise the fact that these women are incapable of making these relationships, don't have the communication skills. When they sit in a room with social workers and they're in care team meetings or they're going to court, they're in a professional environment. They're in an environment where everybody in that room has been university educated or higher educated. We've all got, competencies to work to. We've got line managers to keep all right. Hopefully we'll have one-to-ones where we can ask for support when we need it. They've got none of that, but they're going to have to perform the job of advocating for themselves and for the children at a time where they're at the lowest ebb, least capable of it. The exercise we do later, I'm going to ask you to reflect on that when you're going through it and think about it from your position. So beware. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next one is Gina's story. I'm going to tell you the end of Gina's story first. She was mind-blowing. She was absolutely mind-blowing. And where she is today is she has 2 children in her care and 2 children out of her care. And this was really common. Before I started doing anything in child removal, I thought the picture would look like, you would have a child removed. How could you ever have other children? If you're then capable to have children, surely you would be allowed your other children back. No, that's a very naive view. That's absolutely not the case and almost never happens. In fact, I'm yet to witness it. I haven't seen it happen yet. So she has 2 of her children back, 2 of her children still in care. She now works as a domestic violence advocate for other women, supporting other women who are going through what is incredibly challenging situations. And she's a force of nature. She's absolutely amazing. Her story is really sad. So she gave quite a bit of background about her childhood. And she didn't say this, and I was rereading her transcripts last night and this morning ahead of doing this. It's really obvious she was raised in a household where there was coercive control. She let things slip, like her mum would sneak out to see her. Who needs to sneak out of the house, And so she was raised in an environment where she was shown a normal version of relationships of a man being very controlling, and then walked into a very domestically violent relationship. In fact, she was sitting at GCSEs, pregnant at 15, with a teenage boyfriend, who she then moved in with because her mum and dad kicked her out. And everything just kind of tumbled from there. That guy, very quickly became violent. That baby passed away, sadly, a couple of weeks after being born of cot death. But the trauma of it was absolutely overwhelming for her. I've never lost a child, but I can only imagine what that would be like. And she didn't have any therapeutic support. She didn't have any medication for what she said, looking back, was guaranteed postnatal depression. And within 5 months, because she was living in his family's home as well, so accommodation was reliant upon this relationship. And even though it had become violent and she'd lost this baby, it's like this, you can't see out of it. There's this fog that you just can't see out of. She was pregnant again within 5 months, and this time she had the baby, but with terrible trauma attached to it. And so that bond, she just could not make that bond. That beautiful quote that was read out earlier about the harrowing effects of child removal at birth, it still happened for her. You know, she didn't get that oxytocin. She could not connect with this baby, and her partner was so angry with her that he would beat her for it regular. He thought he could beat the bond into her. So that relationship went on for a long time. She reached out once to a grandma, and a grandma sent her home and said, "You've made your bed, lie in it." And so that's the environment that she was in. So she did. She put up and she shut up, and she made it through. But she also made a plan to get out. After years of this, she made a plan to get out and packed secret bags and put them away. And when she knew her mum was going on holiday for a week, she phoned her mum to come and get her at 7 o'clock that morning. And the reason why it was that morning was because he was so drunk the night before, she knew she was going to get a beating that she might not live through the next day. I cried reading this morning as I read through it, because she's just such an incredible woman. So she got out of it. I mean, by the time she's getting out of that relationship, she's absolutely buckled. But she ploughs on. So she gets her own place, she starts to work, things go better for her. Third relationship, so there's relationships, and children. By her third relationship, she was using alcohol and drugs to cope with the day-to-day of what just sounds like a horrific situation. And again, she never told anybody. You know, these things were absolutely behind closed doors for her. She was too frightened. And what happened for her was one of her children had global developmental learning delay. I think I've said that right. And so she reached out for help, and they started the assessment process and looking at what was going on at home. And instead of getting that assessment, which they got years later, originally it was just diagnosed or pathologized as this is a family issue, there's loads of drama going on at home, there's nothing wrong with this child other than the environment they're in. The focus, all intervention focus as well from social services, was focused on her drug use and not the domestic violence. And at one point, this is her quote, I said, "Can't you just take me to a women's refuge?" And she laughed at me and said, "You don't need a women's refuge, you're doing this to yourself." And when she said that, I lost all composure and shrieked. I shrieked that this was said to her. Loads of time bundled on with this. It's completely unravelled. I mean, the story goes on that the longer they're involved with social workers, the less competent they are within these environments, the more the wheels start to fall off. And I can see it from a professional perspective. I'm so fortunate that when I sit with these women, I have a very different relationship with them. I love these women. They are the most inspirational people I can ever spend my time with. But when they're presenting in those meetings, they're angry and they're shouting because they're in fight or flight. You know, they absolutely are panic stations. So much of that, I don't have to draw the lines of comparison, but so much of that was not her fault. It was absolutely her responsibility. Again, there wasn't anybody there to say, right, here's what's going wrong, let's fix it, let's plug you into the services that exist. These things exist, we know they exist. I work with people in this room who provide phenomenal services. What's the disconnect? And relationships matter. Again, where she was, and if you meet her, she's such an amazing woman today. If you meet her, she has all of those skills. She has all of those communication skills now. You know, she's ran through all of these programs that we like people to run through. She's working as a domestic violence advocate. You know, she's free from these relationships, and she's got the skills to manage relationships. She had none then. So what do we do? And the last thing that I'll say about both of these women is there's the power dynamic. They walk into rooms where everybody has power and control over their lives and the children's lives, and they don't. And how honest can you be in those rooms? Especially when the answer is, thank you for being honest. We can't offer you anything, so we're just going to write it down and use it against you. That's it. That's all you've got.